In 1958, Chrysler was 1 year into the so-called forward-look cars that had set the industry on fire when they were introduced in 1957, and that was in a good way. The 57 Chryslers were some of the most beautiful cars of the late 1950s and still are prized by collectors today. However, while the sheet metal was all new, that was not the only change that was introduced on these new forward-look Chryslers in 1957. More specifically, it would be the first year of some mechanical bits, like the torsionaire ride. The 1957 Chryslers first displayed the use of torsion bar front suspension and leaf spring rear suspension. These cars still did have full frames at this point. Later, Chrysler would transition to unibody on everything but the Imperials. But the torsionaire ride was quite novel for its time, did help the car from a handling perspective, and the way that Chrysler had set up the geometry on the suspension, it helped prevent against brake dive on brake apply as well as rear end squat on acceleration. Now, under hood, a lot of the Chryslers had some great engines and, well, transmissions. The Torque Flight was always known as a very reliable transmission, although you had the push-button Torque Flight in these Chryslers until 1965 when they would do away with that. But as an example, the 58 Chrysler 300D, kind of the top of the, let's call it Banker's hot rod performance spectrum, came with a 392 cubic inch V8. That was a carryover from 1957 and the 300C, but the base engine was now rated at 380 gross horsepower compared to 375 gross horsepower in 1957. However, there was an optional engine. And in 1957, an optional engine for the 300C put out 390 horsepower. It basically had a more aggressive camshaft that helped give it another 15 horsepower. But in 1958, Chrysler would employ something different to get that additional horsepower boost to the 390 horsepower. And that was a much maligned and awful fuel injection system that was developed by Bendix, the so-called Bendix Electrojector fuel injection system that we're going to talk about more today. So this really replaced the two 4-barrel intake and carburetor setup as the top engine option on the 58 300D. And it was so failed and so maligned that all of the cars were recalled. You could get the Electrojector fuel injection on a number of Chryslers, but the 300D was the one where it had proved most popular as an option. And by most popular, I mean that the production was still highly limited. I believe it's speculated that approximately 35 1958 Chryslers were produced with this Electrojector fuel injection. 16 were Chrysler 300Ds, 12 were DeSotos, 5 Dodges, and 2 Plymouths. But it's hard to really discern production figures because they were so low, and I don't believe that accurate production figures were kept at this point in time. Now, before we delve into the details on the 1958 Electrojector injection, I'll just say that this was a 1-year-only option. In 1959, it would go away because of all of the issues, and Chrysler would also change the engines under hood. In 1959, there was the 413 wedge engine, the so-called Golden Lion. And that was much lighter than the old Hemis that Chrysler was using, and it still made 380 horsepower. So this was really the last of the old school Chrysler Hemi V8s in the 1958 300D and the 1958 Chrysler lineup. And that was what was outfitted with this Bendix Electrojector fuel injection system. So now let's take a step back for a moment and just talk a little bit about this. As I said, it was developed by Bendix. This was not a Chrysler product, but of course Chrysler is responsible for integrating supplier technology and making sure that it works well for customers. And clearly that was not something that happened in this case. Now, before Chrysler decided to outfit it on its vehicles for 1958, Bendix was advertising in various trade journals this electronic fuel injection for passenger cars. And that's an important point. It was a, let's call it electronic fuel injection, but let me specify more about electronic in a second, because this used all analog componentry, not digital componentry. There weren't circuit boards and things like that back then. There were vacuum tubes and transistors. And that's really what this was employing, although the vacuum tubes would go away after a little bit because vacuum tubes take a while to warm up. And, well, nobody wants to warm up the vacuum tubes before they can start their car. So the system was transitioned to transistors at the first opportunity. But Bendix was advertising in various trade journals this electronic fuel injection system in the mid-1950s. And you can see a picture of it here in an advertisement. And if you take a look at the valve covers, you can note what this is outfitted to. It's actually outfitted to a Buick Nailhead V8. Now, clearly, General Motors didn't go with this kind of setup. Rochester Products Division at GM would develop their own fuel injection system that would come out in 1957 on the Chevrolets. And that was a relatively reliable system, and it was all mechanical. But here, I guess Chrysler was trying to respond to that and couldn't do so fast enough, so they went with this Bendix-style fuel injection setup. Now, interestingly, before Chrysler decided to outfit this on their V8s for 1958, American Motors wanted to outfit it on its 1957 Rambler Rebel with the 327 cubic inch V8. And the Rebel brochures from 1957 featured the fuel injection system. The engine with this particular setup was displayed alongside the Rambler Rebel at the New York Auto Show, and that's what this is a picture of. This is a picture of an engine on a stand outfitted with the Bendix Electrojector injection system. But importantly, none of these Rambler Rebels that were outfitted with this Electrojector injection made it into customers' hands. And the main reason was apparently that American Motors just couldn't get this setup to work with cold weather starting. And why is that? Well, it's because a couple things. The way that this setup worked, there really was no compensator for cold weather starting initially, and the end result was that it just didn't work quite well. The way the setup worked was that there was a manifold absolute pressure sensor that was in series with a throttle position sensor, and that combined signal would basically send the signal to the electronic modulator, which would then trigger the fuel injectors and vary the pulse width of the injectors. So they were basically on for a longer period or a shorter period. Notice I didn't say there was an engine coolant sensor associated with this. It's just the manifold absolute pressure sensor, which was functioning as a potentiometer, and the throttle position sensor. That was it. So engine coolant temperature was not an input parameter in this setup, and therefore, in cold weather, fuel doesn't atomize as well in cold weather, and you have to have richer mixtures in order for the cars to start well. Hence, chokes on these old cars, whether automatic or manual. The choke flap basically closes, and that forces the carburetor into a more rich condition, which is required for cold weather starting and drivability, as I said, because fuel just doesn't atomize as well at colder temperatures. And it's not the liquid fuel that is combusting inside the engine, it's the fuel vapor. You need fuel vapor. And this system just didn't have a way to compensate for that. Chrysler did, apparently, when it was introduced, had like a fast idle circuit, if you will, on here that would increase the throttle position setup to try to richen the mixture a little bit, but it just didn't work. And clearly American Motors, as I said, just couldn't make it work in cold weather starting. And all those Rambler Rebels were outfitted with a Carter 4-barrel carburetor instead of the Electrojector injection. Unfortunately, the Electrojector injections, by the way, it's hard to say quite a few times fast, problems didn't end there. It'd be one thing if it were just cold weather drivability, but apparently the system wasn't all that well tested by Chrysler in the real world. And what do I mean? There were reports that one of the vehicles in the press fleet that was outfitted with this Electrojector injection in the Detroit, Michigan area drove by the WJR radio studio tower and it quit and it wouldn't restart because of the electrical interference associated with the radio broadcast signal. Now, I actually think that was a true story because Chrysler did then add some shielding to the setup to try to prevent that from happening. But again, it just really didn't work, and they had to recall all of the alleged 35 that were produced. I don't even know how many survive today. There's maybe a literal handful. But the electronics just couldn't handle the interference. And kind of as a result of this failed program, Bendix shelved this Electrojector program in 1960, and they just gave up on it because consumers really didn't value it more than a carburetor, especially given how troublesome that it was. And, well, it cost 20 times as much as a carburetor. So that's not a great value proposition for the customer. Now, interestingly, Bendix and Bosch of Germany would form a joint venture and would eventually use this electrojector technology as the basis of Bosch Getronic fuel injection. And this was introduced in Volkswagen 10 years later from the Chrysler setup in 1968. And it really was just a refined version of the Electrojector setup. So Electrojector did give birth to some newer fuel injection systems, but they were, let's just say, much more refined than what was on the Electrojector setup. Bendix did recover a little bit, and they ended up making fuel injection systems, electronic fuel injection systems, that is, although these had truly digital processors as well as different sensors for Cadillac. And in 1976, as an example, the Cadillac Seville came standard with Bendix fuel injection, and you could get optional Bendix source fuel injection on your Cadillac 500 cubic inch V8 in your Eldorado or your DeVille, etc. And that was a better setup. It did have still some drivability issues. I personally would prefer, if you have the choice of getting a Cadillac from that era with a carburetor or the Bendix setup, get one with the carburetor because it's getting very hard to find the EFI parts, as you can imagine. But that was a better setup, and that did have an engine coolant temperature sensor in addition to the manifold absolute pressure and throttle position sensors. That was also a feedback setup. It had an oxygen sensor, so the computer could adjust based on the mixture, what it would sense is the mixture, at least in the exhaust stream, and richen the mixture or lean it out. The original Electrojector setup was nothing of the sort. It was just an open loop setup. There was no oxygen sensor that could really help with the overall fuel mixture condition. So a couple of reasons, as I mentioned, that this was failed. One was the electrical interference issue. The second was the cold weather drivability. And the third, I think, this electronic modulator that was employed that had a bunch of transistors in it. It was just so primitive. And like I said, the signal that it was getting was just the manifold absolute pressure sensor in series with the throttle position sensor. And from that, it derived the injector pulse width. By the way, this was a constant pressure setup for the injectors. And that means that the only way that you could vary the fuel delivery was with the length of time that the fuel injector was effectively on, the injector pulse width. You couldn't vary the pressure. So another, let's say, issue associated with this. It's more optimal in fuel injection setups, as you can imagine, that you vary both the amount of time that the injector is on as well as the fuel pressure. But clearly they just couldn't do this in 1958. So that's the story of the Bendix Electrojector fuel injection system. Put a comment in the comment section as to what you think of it. And should Chrysler have gone ahead with this or not? Well, American Motors abandoned it. Maybe Chrysler should have. Thanks again for watching.